Welcome to How People Move People, a podcast about the impact that our words, art, stories, and lives have on each other. Each series journey unfolds in a sequence of 6 episodes. This series, titled Midground, is hosted by dancer, curator, and scholar Dr. Tara Aisha Willis. Midground brings pairs of dance and performance artists together in kinship around their roots and work in the Black Midwest.
So my first question to both of you is if you could just kind of lay out, like, what does the work of Jennifer Harge and the work of Bebe Miller do? What does it feel like? How do you do it?
My first thought is like, which timeline are we talking about? And the present one is the one that's here, of course. And so I think right away that even what dailiness might be in terms of my work, imagining people in a room. I don't have people in a room around me, and that is my first stop. So something about without that in this period of time, I am faced with myself as well as like, what would it take? What does it take? Because we will be getting in a room. What am I going to be bringing into this room with the people that I hoping to work with? But at the same time, I am working, or I am being, let's just say, in a really very different kind of a dailiness than I ever have. Like I'd mentioned before, I'm here on Vashon Island. I'm on an island. It is damp and beautiful. I walk every day, just about at least a good, 40 minutes of down a gravel road and then on a path into a preserved forest, and then turn around and come back, and there's mushrooms, a lot of those. There's moss, there's dampness, there's my dog. And what comes up alongside of that is a reference historically, both into my own past and then just to the history of a particular landscape. And these trees have been here and really don't care who we are. I mean, really. So they will just hopefully go on way past us. So just something about that sense of, we are just tiny. And our timeline is tiny. At the same time, I am completely human and involved in like, what did I read? And like, what's my niece doing? Oh, she just had my new niece, my oldest niece is now a grandmother. Like, oh my goodness, like within the last month. I mean, all of that aspect. So living is coming forward in a particular way. I did a writing retreat about a month ago, and ended up looking a lot at work from that is 30 years old or older of mine, and delving into these particular people who were involved, yes, in the choreography, but like, what are they doing with each other? What did I miss at that moment watching them 30 years ago when I was in a completely different headset? So like, what is that nature of that touch really? That's not choreographic, but is personal. And trying to write about that, both for my own reference, but also so that I could bring somebody else toward the way I see, so that we could kind of share that space. So I feel like I'm in a very present moment and in an older moment at the same time, and just trying to negotiate between those things.
Listening to that is really helpful, just to frame how I think about making and doing. because living and being are so central. Like being present to what I'm feeling, being present to what I'm sensing, what I'm reading, witnessing those around me, how we're interacting with one another. And I think I've always been really informed by those around me and in all kinds of rooms. And I also like my body is really susceptible to other people's energies, and it has been since as long as I can remember. So I think I've always been also collecting a lot of information since I was young. And so for me, making is always coming after absorbing for very long periods of time. And so currently I'm away from my home. I'm in Philadelphia. I've been here for the semester. And being really at times frustrated because I'm not making anything, quote unquote, right now, or like don't feel I'm active. And then like a week will pass and I'm like, oh, I was sitting last week. Okay. That's what we were doing. That's what was happening. Or like I'm cooking or whatever but I'm being in this space, I'm settling or like trying to settle in a place I don't really live in or don't live in. But all those things are really important to me. They always have been. And I think in this kind of fall energy where people are really active right now, I can sense how I'm not really producing anything, but I'm listening to a lot. There's also a lot of information to be listening to, like especially in a social media context, or just, inundated with information. But that I've just been remembering lately, like, oh yeah, I also need to be, and being is how I understand, how I orient myself before and while I'm doing things. And when it was warmer too, where I am in West Philly, I was walking a lot through the neighborhoods and admiring all of these Philly homes, which are so distinct. And I know we'll talk about Midwest proper in a little bit, but I was thinking during my walks for like my first 2 months of being here, I was thinking about Black migration routes a lot. And I was like, we could have ended up here. Like, oh, but we ended up in Detroit, but this could have been the place. And so imagining is also a lot of how I like come to understand things. But yeah, a lot of witnessing. And I mean, when I was younger, maybe still, it was about being kind of nosy. But now I'm just like in awe of lots of things. But yeah, but living in remembering that like that living is not always wondrous, sometimes it's agitating and frustrating, but it's happening. I've been really frustrated what feels like inactivity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh, you just kind of you've been collecting even your frustrations. Like I'm learning that like this particular thing makes me frustrated. Yeah, and then I'm slowly feeling less pressure to feel I have to put those things to use. Mm-hmm.
I just want to name that I've had the privilege of taking workshops with both of you as a mover, and they were very different from each other. But like halfway through your workshop this year, Jennifer, for movement research, like everyone, it was like a workshop for Black movers specifically, and everyone was like, we need to take a nap. So we spent an entire session on Zoom. It was a Zoom workshop also. So we were all just like on Zoom resting for 2 hours. And then we did it again. 2 days in a row. We did it the next day. So I just want to name that.
Oh my gosh.
And then, I know. And then Bebe, I mean, it was a totally different context, but I feel that there's a similarity in like that prioritizing the storing and the fact that like the process doesn't have to feel like it's or look like it's doing something, but it is anyway. Like that understanding that like there is no action in the body that is like wasted. It's, you know what I mean? Or doesn't show up later in some way. It's all part of the process, I think was really central to that workshop that you taught, also on Zoom. And so
Also
in two
on
different
Zoom.
ways. Yeah, in two different ways, that same like going into hibernation mode is not just like a pause. It is intaking other information. To hear you both talk about that in different ways and at different kind of moments in your artistic lifetimes also is really beautiful, and I think really powerful, especially like for Black women. And you know what I mean? Like that is also, there's a layer of that I'm feeling also that's really important. But I'm curious also to hear each of you just extend what you just said and maybe name even more precisely what happens when you go into a studio.
My relationship to studios is shifting all the times. I'm sure it's true for all of us. And so being in Detroit for so long, where there really hasn't been access to studios, I had to make studios. And so even like my entry into space has been, my first question is like, well, what do I need, or what do I want? Who do I want to be there? And so I've been building them a lot. And for me, it's like, well, who are the people? And many times they are coming from different worlds, both inside and outside of dance. And like, do you need paint? Do you just like something else for the ideas to kind of like be messy, like a way to be messy in my ideas? And so the studios lately are messy, which feels really helpful, because dance studios have been really stressful for me for a long time, of like, it's not enough stuff in here and you can't get messy enough in here. And like, I don't know what to do once my body was like at its max. I'm like, there's other materials that I'm needing, but then you can't leave them in there because you got somebody else coming in after you. And it just was like, the space doesn't work. So it's been a lot of like, defining what the space needs, really because I had to, as just like a void of the space I was living in. And then like seeing how all those things are in conversation with each other feels like then how the studio starts working, or like trying to create non-hierarchical relationships between them. So as a mover, it's really complicated sometimes when the dance is not central all the time. I'm like, am I doing the dance right if it's not the main thing? But sometimes it's not supposed to be the main thing. And so trying to hear my impulses well enough to know when we slip in and out of moving into maybe writing, into sound things, or something like installation, collage based. Like, how do I listen to when the changes happen? Is how studio practice has been operating for me lately.
Oh, that's so interesting. And it makes me realize that I tend not to have things, paper or something to color with or crinkle. And when I'm with people, and maybe but that crinkling as an activity, a verb of things. So when I was on this writing retreat and I had a studio and I was pacing more than I was like, wrinkling the space. And I realized I was also watching video of this work from 30 years ago. Actually, no, it's almost 40 years ago now. Okay. Small point. Large point. But I was without reference that I usually have of other people and where they are and what we talk about. Like, can you triangulate the humanity? And there is no always, but it seems in thinking back that I tend not to have a theme or an idea when I walk in the first time for what could be a project. But it's like, hey, well, how are my feet landing today?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, this seems to be important. And then it becomes something I return to maybe the next day or the following day and start tracking that procession of physicality. But without that, without other people in the room, there is my mind is, and my body is less particular about, well, what shall I do movement wise? And I find that I'm pacing generally clockwise. Now I think of it clockwise, and gesture may emerge, but the pacing kind of continues. So I'm in a phase where it's like, well, if they're not in the room, well, what am I thinking of? And how am I moving? Because that never really does go away. That's always there.
I'm just thinking about the clockwise procession pacing.
Mm-hmm.
And when you said it, like my body shot, because I have a clockwise procession that I've been calling a clearing. Like when things get like, I don't know what's going on. I take clockwise laps. And there's even like, it's been drawn on the wall before, like as a reminder, like if things get messy, you remember you can just clear it out. So I'm just curious for you, like, it feels like it's like orienting you towards something, but I'm wondering if it ever has like other directions.
I mean, other directions in space or other directions?
No, or like in thinking or in like just the ways it shifts the room, perhaps.
Yeah. Probably. And it doesn't necessarily kind of clarify itself right away. There's a joke I tell to myself that when I'm in the room with other collaborators, other dancers, I'm watching a lot, and I say, like, what is that? What is that? And there's nobody to ask that of when I'm by myself. So it's like, I know this. I know this and that. This is what it is. This is right. This has a rightness right now. So that's a curious thing about, are we solving something, or are we reminding ourselves what we already know? And I like that those are both really deep possibilities in either direction for us to go in.
Mm-hmm.
Since you're both not currently in the Midwest, I'm going to ask you both to each talk about the last time you were in the Midwest, or the last time you can like remember very vividly that you were in the Midwest, where you were, and something that mattered about that time, something that you loved about that time, or that felt poignant or memorable about that time.
I'm trying to think, because this year is the longest that I've been away from the Midwest in like a decade. But I was home in the Midwest over the summer. And for Detroit in particular, and I'm missing it right now, especially being in the Northeast, what feels special to me is the landscape and the sprawling nature of the space. Like, to have that much space feels, I forget how important that is to me. And it was Detroit in the summer, which is, I feel like many northern cities, a whole vibe when the summer comes because, you have survived the winter. And so like there's a summer energy when I was there. And then Detroit is incredibly green in the summer too. So like all of those combined feels, there's a settling in that's possible for me. But my memory of it, whenever I go back, I think.
I'm loving the landscape thing. And it's funny, I was last in Columbus, Ohio, probably in August, and it's where I'd been living since, for 20 odd years, and I will be going back. I don't live very far from Ohio State campus, and there's a road, Kenny Road on West Campus, where they used to let the cows out in the morning and through the evening of the agricultural school, and that there's corn growing, and this is not far from Target or any of the mall aspect of a Midwestern town. And I remember when I first got there of just like, there's something about that sky. I get to see the color change. It faces west, and so I see sunset, and more than just the sun actually setting, but just the range of color that happens. And I think back to, growing up in Brooklyn way back in time, very different from the Brooklyn that I've been to recently, and how sky is just not evident in the same way, or it's about what's around the buildings. So I remember when I first moved to Columbus, just like I didn't expect that openness to affect me so deeply. So, and how did that or not work itself into my work? I'm not sure how it worked itself into my work. But one thing that did happen being in Ohio is my timing of how I worked completely changed. Wow. From, say, New York studio life, 4 days a week, 3-4 hours a day, Monday through Thursday, boom, 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 over certain months, stretching to working with people and in a space where I didn't have that regularities, but we were able to do 2 or 3 weeks at a time intensively, where we definitely had lunch together, definitely probably had dinner as well, and that resting time in between in the middle of the day. So something about the expansiveness or the expanding, contracting focus of how you can follow an idea, how time is on your side, weirdly, was very much a part of being in the Midwest. I have to say, I love that the three of us are talking about landscape on a particular level. And maybe because I grew up in the city, I don't know, but I don't remember having landscape conversations with Black women. Maybe just because I was just growing up and we were all just growing up. So it might be an age thing, but it's amazing is not the right word. I think something less charged, but like it is satisfying on a level that I still want to kind of figure out, like how much work we are able to see now that reflects the land, that's about going back to land. Mm-hmm. Even if it's not the planting land, it is, the corner stoop land that we recognize the architectural value of the land, where we've been, where we came from, where we're going. So all of that.
I'm just thinking about within that expanse and then not necessarily like coming into contact with humans like so immediately. For me, at least, I was then like things lingered, like my ideas lingered,
Mm.
how I'm in space lingers, like I'm not cut off by many things very often. And then even thinking about, Bebe, you talking about how your rehearsal structure changed. When I got to Detroit as working as a professional artist, we had Sundays. Like that was the day that I was making the works. So then for me, then I had to like find ways to hold from to week. And so even like that literal expanse between the days and how much information is then entering in between all of that time and space. So something as I'm listening, like that expanse is bringing me into a deepening into land in ways that I don't experience in like more populated cities.
To get a little concrete, can you each just kind of name your relationship with the Midwest really like fairly succinctly? Like, when did you arrive? Obviously at birth for some of us, but also like, why have you stayed or left in the moments when you have left? And why have you come back?
Yes, I was born in Saginaw, Michigan, and went to school, middle school and high school in Saginaw, Michigan. But both sides of my family, so maternal and paternal sides, both are in Detroit as products of the Great Migration. My father's side gets to Detroit from South Carolina, like 1910s. And my grandmother's side comes from Tennessee a little like later. She herself and her family come like 1940s. And some people come a little before then. So both sides are, arrive in Detroit and for the most part are still there. And if not in the city proper, like the immediate surrounding areas. And so that's my orientation. It's like very much a familial place for me. And I did not intend on coming back. So, and I spent my life in this kind of back and forth between Detroit and Saginaw. And after going to school and living away, I didn't intend on being in the Midwest or spending my professional life there. I swear I moved back from grad school and I was like, in 6 months, I'm moving to Brooklyn. This is the moment to like have the New York moment. And that October, I premiered the first work that was the collective I created, Harge Dance Stories. And I remember that show ending and I was like, I forgot to move to Brooklyn. It just like completely left my mind for several months. And so after that moment, like the idea of New York just kind of also didn't even seem necessary. And so, like the family structures and like then being in or artistic communities are what keep me there and what has me there as a professional.
My mother left her home in Meridian, Mississippi when she was in her 20s to come to New York. Which would have been early 40s, maybe during the war. World War II. I'm not sure. She came to be a domestic. A cousin of hers got her a job with a family, a doctor's family. And when I talk to her sisters, my aunts, they always say, Hazel was just the good one, the quiet one, just really focused. And she died when I was in my 20s, so a while ago. But she came, she was so impressed. The family of the doctor, or the doctor himself, that he paid for her to go to nursing school. So she became a nurse. And then being mostly a single parent, she felt like, well, I need to be home when the kids come. So she became an elementary school teacher. And then the story goes, it's like, well, the people that I was working for, their kids went to dance class and music class. So my kids are going to go. So she sent us to Henry Street. So it was just like this whole, like, here you are, and these are the things that are available for you. At a young age, I'm not thinking like, well, these are the things that are available to me. It's just like, this is fun. This is what I want to do. Dance, music, the woods. She was a camp nurse in Maine, so we all went with her. So thank you, Mom. Thank you, Mommy. And at the same time, though, just setting us up in Brooklyn with all of that Brooklyn Gowanus, where you don't go, Bronx, you never go. You know, how you shape your childhood landscape just stays with you for quite a while. But all that to say, when it got to be college time, we were living in Queens at the time, and I was like, nah, I don't want to be close here. I want to go away. I went to the Midwest. I was in a small school in Indiana, and Quaker school. I was one of like maybe 27 Black students out of 1,400. But it was an introduction to the Midwestern landscape. I saw corn growing for the first time. I saw that particular farm with the central farm home and the trees around it, and everything else was just plots of crops, of just a way of living and being land-wise that I hadn't seen before. Years pass, things happen. My mother passes away, and timing had it that it allowed me maybe just the relief of leaving the city to go back to the Midwest to grad school at Ohio State and re-enter that kind of landscape. So all this to say, I enjoy that I can reflect on all these variations of vertical and horizontal and space and compression. So, but grad school, wonderful. Yeah. But also the return again, 10 years later and spending some time teaching and then returning again 15 years after that, of just entering and living in the town of Columbus, Ohio, which is different than the job of a university. And how long it actually took for me to feel like, what is on that east side that is not near me, and where all that particular kind of Black folk neighborhood thing is going on versus another kind of neighborhood where I was. And actually, versus is it's not an either or. There's just like, there's different ways of being. So I think, like many New Yorkers, it is the place to be from. I mean, wouldn't everybody want to be from New York? Come on. But I'll move on from there. But I remember leaving New York thinking like, New York, watch me go, huh? Okay, I'm going now. As if New York is watching. But it's sort of just saying that just to give a sense of like who you think you are because you're from New York, and then who you think you are when you were in land, and allowing like land and people and to really to honor all of that in the person I was trying to be, as well as the work that I was trying to make. So I feel, I will just always be a New Yorker who doesn't live there anymore, which is different than being a Midwesterner.
Since you're both not currently in the Midwest, do each of you think of when you hear the phrase, the Black Midwest?
For me, Black Midwest is like a northern South, which many folks have talked about for, in different ways. But I sense that being here in Philly, I sense a little bit of that too, but it feels more pronounced in the Midwest of how much the South continued. And maybe something about that, the expanse that we talked about earlier, where you had space to like build your worlds in a particular way, where I think coming to like a Northeast city, you build in the structures that are there. Like the structures feel more rigid in the Northeast. And I think about like Black domestic spaces. I think about that a lot in my own work, and it as its own kind of world making place. And as I go from like Black homes in Chicago, in Detroit, in Dayton, it like they have so many, like the textures, the energies of them are so familiar, and so much of that I attribute to the Southern roots. And so I feel that connectivity between North and South really clearly, which feels like a Black Midwest to me. And I'm been so interested in accents lately, and like from a linguistic standpoint, just like listening to folks, how Black folks talk. And I've always been interested in linguistics, but like kind of from afar. But being in Philly, and I have a couple cousins who moved from Detroit to Philly, let's say 20 years ago. And so, and their Philly accents are thick. So being here in Philly, I just keep thinking I'm hearing my cousins. I'm like, is that Kansas? I'm like, oh, that's just Philly. That's where I am right now. And so when I go back to Detroit, I'm like, oh, I hear it. Like there's something on the tongue that is happening, that I hear it in Chicago. And so I'm also just thinking about, like that Southern drawl that's happening in the mouth of people in the North and the Midwest in particular. But yeah, I feel really not just aligned with it, but like empowered by it. Like it feels like I feel very connected to it. I'm like, oh, that is where I am from. That has shaped how I understand so many things in my life. How I understand timing, how I understand like being with people is so much shaped in my time with my family and communities in Midwest spaces. And I'm excited to keep, like, I've been trying to write about Detroit now for like 3 years, and I'm like slowly getting into that. So I'm excited by a Black Midwest and thinking into it, because it feels like it's like at the bottom of how I've been working for so long.
I feel in my time in the Midwest more kind of an outsider. And I think now, because of my time in the Midwest, when I'm in New York, I'm kind of an outsider. So I wonder if that is part of the whole shift that's actually going on, about being from a place to being observing and seeing. And maybe this is a kind of more sentimental or a deeper kind of self-reflection of just, have I always been an outsider? Maybe it's the outsider thing of like, what is it to belong to that neighborhood? I know when we were growing up in the Red Hook projects in Brooklyn, in fourth grade, starting in fourth grade, I went to a different school in Flatbush on the subway by myself with my brother, age 9. And it was sort of like, well, we always went away in order to kind of do all the things that were fun and interesting, or that we had to do. So when I think of Midwest, I think home. Black Midwest, home for the Black Midwesterners. But I don't feel myself as one of those.
Yeah.
And I feel like an ex-New Yorker who lives in the Midwest more than anything, which is neither here. I'm not sure where I belong, actually. So.
Yeah. I relate to that experience of kind of being shipped to a different neighborhood for school. I was shipped to private school on the other side of the city because of my own parents' like aspirational goals for me, and like this kind of which I mean, my mom is white, and so there was a piece of that was part of it as well, and both of them were educators, so they had very clear beliefs about education specifically, but I think for my dad in particular, it was really about like the idea of success, right? And his mom had been a domestic worker in Jackson, Mississippi, and worked in such a way, like her entire goal of existing, of her life and her work was to ensure that her two kids could go to private school for even just 1 year. And they went for 1 year in elementary school, and that was like the goal, because if you could get some of that, even a piece of that, right, then you could kind of climb this ladder in a different way than previous generations. So I think that I inherited that. And so that is, to me, even though you had that experience in New York, that's Black experience, right? That's a particular part of Black experience, is this kind of intentional, like if we can gain education, if we can gain these access to these things, even though we can't have access to these other things, like we have the evidence that we have value, when someone asks, we can say, I went here for school, right?
Yeah. And so something, we can't ignore the whole context of our histories. We are different ages. We've all gone through several decades of like ways of thinking about who we are as a community and as a non-community, as an individual even. And just, the rise and fall of that individuality. It's like, I can do it myself, that kind of thing. And maybe thankfully we are at a time where like, no, I need these other folk with me in order to do myself. So I don't know. I mean, I the contextual reading of these landscapes of time and opportunity and how and what that looks like. And then when I see images of contemporary choreographers going out into not the field, but like the corner open lot and planting, and that is like the demonstration of an urge that maybe they didn't even know they had 15 years ago. So just the rise and fall of land and like ownership, or not the ownership, but digging in, and how that has been of a different value over time. We are not constant, and our political social situation is not constant.
Yeah. But the phrase Black Midwest is interesting to me because I think it's a different map than the map of the Midwest. Like, I think it has to do with histories of industry that Black people have flocked to over time, and it has to do with Great Migration maps in a different way. And it, so there's some arguments that like Pittsburgh is part of the Midwest suddenly when you start to think about the Black Midwest, and it isn't necessarily considered part of the Midwest. Like Pennsylvania is not part of the Midwest, right? So there's these kinds of things, and there's maybe areas of the Midwest as the nation, as the US might describe it, that are not part of the Black Midwest. And there's maybe more emphasis on the cities when you start to think about the Black Midwest than there might be. But there's also these folks, Black communities in other parts of them, in small towns that have existed for a long time and aren't known about, right? So I think there's something productive in it because of that, all the things I just listed. And there's this really amazing, like super famous people have Black folks, like in the arts, like across the art, like Toni Morrison and all these people are from the Midwest, like Langston Hughes is from the Midwest, of course, tons of musicians that are famous and all of that. But it's like, there's all these amazing people that come from here, all these activists, all, different fields. And there's not always this association of those figures with the Midwest, even though they're from here. So that, to me, there's something that makes Blackness in the Midwest somehow less visible than in other parts of the country, than in the East, West, and in the South somehow. So that has been like a curious thing to me. And in that book that we were just talking about, Jennifer, in the intro, there's a quote about like, there's a certain modest posture. This is the phrase that the author uses, Jamala Rogers. to Midwesterners in general, maybe, but maybe specifically Black Midwestern culture that means that there's not a recognition as visible, right, to other folks outside of this context. Anyway, so it's like, what is productive about thinking of this as one network somehow? I'm curious about that.
It's funny,
Jennifer,
because in listing Toni Morrison and Langston Hughes and all these musicians, they left. So there's that like rereading of the strings of attachment, which is not the same as like having them have, them staying. So their connection to home is what we're really seeing in their work, which is not so much. So then it's not localized on the landscape in a way. It's like something that has been, inherited and embodied. And so maybe that's why Pittsburgh or other places, parts of Brooklyn are, that where the Midwest actually lives, where the peopleness lives. It's not so much. And their remembrance of the landscape, perhaps even.
Yeah.
But that's what we're reading as well.
Right. Yeah. Totally. Yeah.
But it's making me, so you saying Toni Morrison, so now I'm like, just my brain is thinking through various Toni Morrison novels. And there's something about a Black Midwest that feels like the motivations feel very different than like a coastal city. So without that kind of visibility, and I learned this from working in Detroit, I'm pretty clear, but without that kind of visibility, like my motivations aren't so externally motivated. And if I think about like the characters in like a Sula or Song of Solomon, like they are reflection, they are being with themselves and making sense of the world with the people who are there. And that feels very Black Midwest to me. And that feels important to me as like a way to orient, as a way to make, of like, to not be looking out at a New York for how I should be or whatever. Like I'm in the community I'm in. This is that there's a knowing here, and I'm going to be with that knowing. And those who read are welcome to see, but not trying to shift the knowing just because like an outsider is coming in.
Yeah.
And that feels very particular to the region, for Black folks in the region.
I think it's interesting just bringing up Toni Morrison in terms of her reflections back into her characters and her choice at a certain point in her writing life to like, I'm not going to name these as Black people. They are people. So of just, and then, allowing us to all go in and see ourselves. I mean, she always allowed us to. So but I'm also really curious about Toni Morrison as a writer, and her job in a way is to kind of step back and look from the outside in order to really kind of figure out like what is going on. How do I talk about this? What's the three-dimensionality of this way of living? And when I think back to my to Red Hook and Brooklyn and my kind of, the project's life as a very particular way of not going out and showing like who I'm gonna be. It's like, who's here? What are we gonna do right now? Okay, let's stay here. Blah, 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 which is formative and never leaves. So is it about how we also notice in ourselves as artists, perhaps, that sense of like, I have to step outside this in order to see what it looks like. I have to be able to define this. And I don't define it as well if I'm being on the inside. Yeah. And I don't know, it's funny about like trying to, I'm thinking about, choreographic processes where spending time trying to like, no, the rhythm is not quite like that. It's more of da-da-da, and the gesture is, no, that's not quite it. But what if we do this? Can we feel a difference of that? So qualifying to the nth degree of like, what is that thing I felt? Who are these people, and what does that glance mean, and what's the angle of that fire in the eyes to the other person, and that there's a distance that's implied. And I think, and I wonder how much of just even, the Black Midwest term is a way of putting a shape or a container around that outsider eye, because you need a certain kind of outsider eye to see inside or to transfer that information.
How People Move People is brought to you by the National Center of Choreography at the University of Akron, or NCC Akron. This podcast is produced by Jennifer Edwards. James Sleeman is our editor. Theme music by Ellis Rovin. Sound design by Damon Locks. Transcription by Arushi Singh. Cover art by Micah Krause. I'm DeMarcus Akeem Suggs, Director of Development at Mid-America Arts Alliance, founder and framework culturist at Kumbuntu LLC, and an NCC Akron board member. Special thanks to the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation for their continued support of NCC Akron programming like this. To learn more about NCC Akron, please visit us online at nccakron.org and follow us on Instagram or Facebook at NCC Akron. We hope you enjoyed this episode and encourage you to subscribe on your favorite podcast streaming platform by searching for How People Move People.